Good afternoon.
So my name is Scott Hunter. I'm a program manager on the ASP.NET team. And I've also got Jonathan Carter from Microsoft as well.
Hello.
And we're here today to talk about some of the things that the ASP.NET team is looking at doing beyond .NET 4. So kind of what our agenda is to go look and see what has ASP.NET done previously, and what are we thinking about in the future. And I'll just go through those as we get to them. So in .NET 3.5 SP1, we focused a lot on RAD development. So we did some work with something called dynamic data, which allowed people to build applications really quickly on ASP.NET. Basically, if you had a link to SQL or Entity Framework data model, you could basically just point your application to that, and we would actually scaffold an application. We also did some routing infrastructure for MVC, and it also enables SEO. And we did some AJAX performance with script combining and browser history. And then shortly after that, we actually released MVC 1.0. That's our pro developer framework, which really focuses on giving the developer more control, separation of concerns, and great support for testing. .NET 4, our big focus on .NET 4 has been on proving the things we have in the past. So we did a lot of focus on, if you talk to our web form customers, more control of your markup. One of the frustrations with web forms is basically that in many cases it emits markup that you don't have control over, and does things like have client IDs that get generated by the system that you don't have any control over. So really our goal in .NET 4 was to go and give you a lot more control over that markup, and also make it semantic and make it something that would pass standards. Something else we focused on was in 4 is making people more productive. And so some of that is we took the dynamic data work we did in 3.5 SP1 and made it work with any project. Before, dynamic data had a bunch of requirements. You had to create a brand new project. You had to be using link to SQL or Entity Framework. One of the goals in .NET 4 was to go say anybody using any existing ASP page could basically throw a switch and get a lot of the benefits of validation automatically in their projects. Something else that we've done in .NET 4 is SEO work. So we've done various things to give you more control in your page on SEO, making it very easy to pragmatically control the keywords and descriptions. And we've taken routing and made it a first-class citizen in web forms in .NET 4. And finally, we've done a bunch of work around AJAX performance and more and more integration with jQuery. So let's think about right now, as .NET 4 kind of rolls down, our team is busy thinking about what do we want to focus on next. And there's a bunch of areas that we want to focus in. One of those areas is what we call simplification. So one of the things that we've always done is we've built enterprise-level frameworks, and we'd like to build frameworks that are a little simpler than that can go after a wider audience. I think that affects the enterprise developer as well, because it means you're going to be able to prototype quicker without as much work. One of the things that we've done is we worked on the active record pattern. And so is anybody in the room familiar with active record? Just to get an idea. So for those of you who aren't, active record is basically taking what we call the CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, and putting them directly in your data object. Microsoft's got all these data frameworks, link to SQL, Entity Framework. The active record actually lives on top of Entity Framework, and it makes a simpler case for using for Entity Framework. Basically, you just create a class, derive it from active record. You can call class.save, and it goes in your database. So we're going to do some demos and show that later on today. The next thing is an area we call task-based helpers. And what this is taking a bunch of common operations that we think web developers do and exposing those in a helper library. This is something you're going to see us do more and more of next year with a lot more patterns in there. But some of the ones we're going to show you today are things like, if you build a website and you do image manipulation, it's quite hard in the .NET framework to resize an image or put a watermark on an image. So we're prototyping things like web.image.resize, web.image.watermark. What if you want to use OpenID in your application? You want to make people be able to log into your application using an account on Google, an account on Live, whatnot. We want to enable those things. What if you want to have something that runs in the background? I want to be able to say at 4 o'clock every day, my website goes and looks at the users in the system and emails them a notification. We're going to have a way of scheduling those kinds of things. So Jonathan's going to do a couple examples of some of the things we're prototyping. And then finally, when it comes to simplification, routing, which is a cool feature and is great for SEO, is kind of hard to set up. And so we actually have a new, the code name for it is Smarty Routes, and these are routes that don't require any configuration. And I'm going to do some demos of those. And finally, HTML5 is coming down the pipe slowly, and our team is investigating that, and Jonathan's going to show you a few examples of areas where we're looking at HTML5. And finally, focus on performance. And one of the things that we did in .NET 4 was making our cache model extensible. And so with that, you can actually drop in a caching provider for velocity, which is great for web farm scenarios. And I'm going to do a demo of that. And finally, we're also thinking about performance of web pages. And the best way to get your web pages to perform faster is to cut down the number of requests. One way of doing that is if you have like 30 images in the page, we can take all 30 images, combine them into one image, shoot the one image down the page, and then use CSS to cut it back up into those images. So that's CSS sprites. So at this point, I'll drop it off to Jonathan.
All right, so let's see what Scott didn't just mention in the intro. So when we think about simplification from a holistic standpoint of the framework, it's clear that there are certain tasks and common scenarios that we as web developers do frequently. And you might even think to yourself very much, this really should be baked in. I don't want to have to rewrite this code every time. It just gets very strenuous. So one of the things that we're really thinking about, as Scott mentioned, is how can we look across ASP.NET and even outside of web-only scenarios and find some tasks and scenarios that we can bake in and make really simple, and in many cases as easy as one line of code. And so like Scott mentioned in the intro, things like image manipulation, sending email verifications, doing background tasks, maybe even some AJAX code, OpenID, and so forth. So this is going to be a really exciting initiative in that it's going to end up touching a lot of different places, and it's also an area that we would love to get the most feedback. Because you can imagine, as we want to start compiling this list of things that say, hey, what do you need to do a lot? What do you need help with making easier? That's what we're going to want to hear from you guys. So, So just to reiterate, a couple of examples. We have a long list of these helpers that we're currently investigating right now. And once again, it's very early in the life cycle of these helpers. But some examples of ones that we have are image manipulation. So being able to add a watermark or being able to resize an image. It isn't that hard. Many of you have probably done it before. But once again, it's a very common task that really should be baked in, should be made easier. Something that anybody could do without having to think about it, as well as email. So sending an email in .NET is not hard at all, but having to do it with verification. So if you're creating some type of a forum or a website that's going to require that once a user signs up, they get an email, they have to click to approve, and so forth. So common tasks that you run into a lot. And finally, background tasks. So I know one thing that I talk to a lot of developers and they say is, what's the best practice if I have kind of a long-running process that I want to execute from within an ASP.NET website or within a page or from a controller and MVC. And so we want to make that scenario common. And then also file upload with progress. And when we say that, we mean with true progress, in that it isn't kind of a cheap, looks like it's working, but it's really a very kind of a poor man's progress. So we've made modifications to the framework and made it easy to say, if you want to easily do an upload without having to use Silverlight or Flash, you just want to use a simple control in ASP.NET, then you should be able to do that. So once again, these are just some examples, and then we want to hear more from you guys on what are some more scenarios. So we were going to do a demo here, but the demo was having some issues before. So we're going to have to move on there. So here's some examples of what these helpers might look like. So you can imagine having these simple one-liner codes. So who's familiar with like the My class in VB.NET that was introduced a few years ago? So imagine something that follows a very similar paradigm, but seeks to solve it at a one language agnostic fashion. And maybe we'll also have a very web-centric perspective when we think about the type of helpers we're going to do. So here, being able to say imaging.addWatermark, this original, this is the one we want to save that has the watermark, and so forth, being able to resize, right? So those are some pretty trivial examples. And then also imagine a flow chart with being able to do email with verification. So being able to say something like login.register, and then by specifying true there, we're initiating this verification system. So we're not going to replace the existing membership providers that are already in ASP.NET, but you can imagine how we might supplement them with some new functionality and make those scenarios like verification emails much simpler. And then finally, imagine background tasks. So right now, in fact, I was just talking with someone, and they were saying they wanted to run a long-running task from a site, but without having to tie up a thread in IIS. What's the best practice? Many people around them were saying, oh, just create a console application, and in there, call out to it from the web page. That way you're not locking a thread in IIS, and so forth. And for some of us, that might be trivial to do, but it's just not something that most developers want to do. They might not have time, and it's just a pain. So imagine being able to do a simple one-liner that specifies a function or even a Lambda expression and says, run this thing every 10 minutes or every 24 hours. And then that just simply works, and it's handling the processing in the background. So these are the type of ideas. And then finally, the upload progress might look something like this, where so one thing to keep in mind, so in this case, this is more of a visual helper in the same vein as other MVC helpers that render out some type of UI. So it shows kind of the breadth of scenarios that we're thinking about with these task-based helpers, that some of them are more back-end operational type tasks. We're thinking about UI tasks. Really, we want to kind of look across the whole gamut and say, how can we make the end-to-end development experience with ASP.NET much simpler moving forward?
Yeah, let me point out one. Am I on? Hello? Yeah, let me point out one more thing on the file upload with progress. We actually made changes in .NET 4 to enable that. Before, if you actually wanted to, there are some third-party controls out there that actually show file upload with progress, and they do that using private reflection or things that don't run in medium trust. So we actually have opened up some new hooks in .NET 4 to actually enable that to work in medium trust. So the next thing that I want to talk about is routing. And routing today, first off, it's awesome for SEO. So if you're building a website today, it's very common to say, you might have a website where you basically have a page, and you might say category ID equals 5, subcategory ID equals 2. The negative of having a website like that is when a search crawler comes across your website, it's not going to be able to pick up anything. It doesn't know what 5 or 2 actually means. So it's great to actually have URLs that have rich names in them, like category and beverages. And that's what when we created routing in the 3.5 SP1 timeframe, this is exactly what it was created for, was for these kinds of scenarios and for building it into MVC. Dynamic Data actually took advantage of routing right from day one as well. And as mentioned, tomorrow in a .NET 4 talk I'm doing, we'll drill in and show how you can use routing in web forms. But the next thing is, really, how can I make routing simpler? So if you look at this first example here, what I would typically do if I want to configure routing on my computer is, in global ASAX, I would create this map page route and give it some queries, give it the way the URL should look, and the actual page that should map to. That can be kind of complicated just to figure out the right parameters you want and stuff like that. What if we just were smart? What if I could just say for ASPX and ASAX, we're going to automatically figure out routing? And what I mean by that is, let's say I have a page called foo.aspx in my website, and you actually give us a URL of foo/bar. Well, we can go to the file system and say there is no file called boo.aspx or bar.aspx. And because of that, then I can walk myself backwards. Oh, there is a foo, so I'll go to the foo page and pass it bar as a parameter. which is what we call by Smarty routes. Basically, we'll take the full URL, try to find something on the disk. If we don't find something on the disk, we follow backwards up the route till we find something on the disk, and then we actually feed everything that we did not find on the disk as parameters to that page. So let me do a demo of what this would look like. So something else that, if you look at modern websites today is, a couple years ago it was okay if every website was like .php or .aspx. Nowadays, we kind of prefer to have what we call extensionless URLs, where I don't actually have to have an extension. So in the case of Smarty routes, is the code big enough, or should I bump the code size up a little bit? Good? Let me just turn it up a little bit anyways. Oops. So in this particular example, all I pretty much do in my global ASAX is I come up and say, here's the extensions that I want Smarty routes to work on. And I'm going to say I want them to work on handlers and ASPX pages. And then all I do is, instead of actually configuring routes for particular pages, I'm just going to call route table routes add. I'm going to add a new Smarty route and give it the list of extensions. So at this point, if I run a page on my app, I can automatically go and wipe out the extension. So one line call, suddenly there is no more ASPX in my application. Where this gets cooler is if you look in my, my app here, I've got a page called category. Now let me turn some code off here. And we'll go to category. Oops. And pass it, for example, a parameter. And of course, I'll get an error because I took the code out. But so what I would do in a Smarty route is we'll look at anything passed on the URL. So in this case, I've got category, and I passed it a value of foo. All I do is I take a variable called category. I call Smarty routes.getNextRouteValue. That's going to get that particular value. If I refresh the page here now I can actually go to category/foo. So we know there's not a foo.aspx there, so we fall back to category and we pass the parameter of foo. What if I want to allow more parameters, like a page? So in this case, I've got a page variable. It doesn't need to be that. And in my page variable, I say getNextRoute. And this getNextRoute actually is smart and takes a generic, and so I can tell it that this time I want an integer. If I save this, now I can pass more parameters, like a page number, and that shows up. If you look at my code in my code here, you'll see all I'm doing is basically just omitting these variables. And then finally, I could actually do add one more, and I could pass something else as well, and they'll show up. So this shows you how you get the benefits of routing without actually configuring routing. I get these nice URLs. And I was also going to show one more example here where, in this case, I actually have a directory called foo, and inside of it I've got a ASPX page called bar, and so I can actually just go to foo bar, and that works. And just showing that this can work with handlers as well, I've got one final page which goes to a handler. My handler is cool stuff quote. If I look in my handlers, I'm going to have a cool stuff in here and a quote. So just showing you how you can get away from having the .aspx and having the question mark value equals, a parameter equals value, just with like one line of code. So this is something you'll see turned on in future web forms and future other stuff we're working on. So let me jump back to the slides. And HTML5.
All right. So how many of us have looked into HTML5 at all a little bit? Yeah? Any of us interested in some of the stuff that it contains? Right? Cool. Cool. So one of the funny things with HTML5 is that a lot of people say, oh, when's Microsoft going to implement the HTML5 standard? But if any of you could show me the official standard for HTML5, I'd be impressed, right? Because it's nothing more than a bunch of feature suggestions that certain browsers and other vendors are implementing. And so we're starting to look at it and say, hey, you know what? There are some great ideas in there and some things that we might want to invest into and see where we can improve our platform. So one of the couple that you've probably seen is having native audio and video directly in HTML. So not having to have some plugin or something just to show a little media, right? Have a really easy experience there, as well as some of the other rich, very semantic markup elements in HTML5. So one of the great things about that recommendation is that it really does add a lot of additional semantics on top of the current HTML spec, and things like menu and footer and aside and so forth really make that rich, right? So we're looking into how do we make those things easy to use, how do we make it expressible in both MVC and web forms, and then so forth and so on. Now from a programmatic feature standpoint, some of the more compelling ones are like drag and drop. So being able to drag an element or item from off a desktop onto the browser or off the browser onto the desktop and have kind of a rich client app experience with a website. But then also web storage with the notion of offline storage. So being able to connect to a site and consume some data, but then pull that data down locally and be able to work with it, modify it, maybe if you don't have an internet connection, and then when you do have an internet connection, being able to push it back, right? So the web storage is currently something that we are actively looking at, and it's one thing that we are going to show. So a couple of things right now is that thinking about the progression that we've made from ASP.NET 2 to where we're going, how many of you remember the menu control circa ASP.NET 2? And the markup it rendered was less than desirable. It was a series of tables. And if you were trying to style this thing or programmatically access it via JavaScript, it was somewhat of a painful experience. Now, one of the great things is that we've taken a huge leap forward in ASP.NET 4 and redone all of the rendering for these controls that were somewhat problematic. So the menu control now is an unordered list, and it's now much more easier to style it and so forth. But we can take it even further and say maybe with HTML5, we then make that a menu element. So it's still clean markup, which is the same experience you have in ASP.NET 4, but it's got additional semantics to what we can achieve today. Now, when we think about the web storage, this becomes very compelling primarily for the offline experiences. So a lot of people today like those things, right? Silverlight has the out-of-browser. There's numerous plugins for different browsers, and you're starting to see browser support for local storage really pick up steam. And so one thing that we at the ASP.NET team at Microsoft want to do is say, how can we enable these type of scenarios and make it easy for you to, if you want to just easily consume and take use of local storage. So let's go ahead and jump into a demo and see an example of a prototype that we're currently working on. So imagine that you have some service on the server and a simple web application here. So in this case, I'm just displaying a list of names here. These are all of my friends back at Microsoft. So we have Scott, we have Phil Hack, the MVC PM, and so forth. Now, when we do a fetch from the server, right, we're getting that list. And we can make modifications to these as well. So I'll say, Cameron, I forget if he has an E in his name, so I'll make that change. And notice that it made the change there because we're using the ASP.NET Ajax for client template binding. But if I now do a save changes, it's going to make a change to the local store. So notice if I close my browser, and then I'll come back and rerun it, the change is going to be persisted, but not on the server. So let me open this up. Notice it's still Cameron without the E, but if I now force a refresh from the server, it's going to introduce the E again, because I was working on local storage. Now, what becomes interesting about this is that if you're already familiar with ASP.NET Ajax 4 and its new client-side support, which how many of us are? Have we played with any of this stuff? So there was a class introduced in the ASP.NET Ajax 4 time release called the ADONet Data Context. Let me close this, I fat-fingered it. Okay, so if we notice here, this type, ADONet Data Context, and what this does is it's a JavaScript client that allows you to consume an ADO.NET data service. And data services are great because you can just easily expose a data model over the web. So in this case, we're simply saying, hit this data service, and this is the object that we're going to use. Now, if you were using ASP.NET Ajax 4 today, you could use this class, and it works seamlessly. So now, how do we get it to work in an offline fashion? So this is where we introduce a second type, which is simply just a wrapper. So notice here we say sys.data.intermediate data context, and it simply wraps the data context server object. So what's cool about this is now acting as a proxy to your actual server implementation. So in this case, we're using data services, but the intermediate data context doesn't care. It's just going to say, I'm going to be the pass-through. Any data you get from the server, I'm going to take and store locally. And in this case, I'm saying the local store is just called test. So because I was running it in Firefox, which fully supports the local storage, that's why I got that experience, right? So this would allow me then, if I was to go offline or I didn't have network connection, I could still work with the data, make changes as you saw, and you can save changes to the store. In fact, if we look at the code for the save changes, you'll notice that all it is simply calling a method save changes right there, right? So to save to the local storage is extremely trivial, and then you just have some success and failure callbacks. So one of the great things about the data context is the fact that it automatically tracks your data. So I say, give me all people from the server. Any changes that I make, it's going to track that, so all I have to do is simply call save changes. Now, what if I want to save the changes to the server, right? Because now that we're working with the intermediate one, we want to say, forget the pass-through, go all the way to the server. So this is where there's a second method we call here. If you go up here, and it's simply right here, save server. And this takes the exact same parameters. So once again, we don't have to actually tell it what data to save because it's tracking that for us. So what's good about this is that we're not introducing much more concepts on top of what we're already releasing. And I say that because we're building on top of something that hasn't actually released yet. So ASP.NET Ajax 4 is still in preview form, right? You can download it today, and it's very robust, but it's not out yet. And so we want to take that and then go even further with it by using the local storage stuff. So what we hope is that we can take these type of scenarios and expand them out even more with the HTML5 type recommendations and make them easy supplemental improvements that you make to your existing applications. So that's kind of the pattern that we want to see happen there. Okay, so let's switch back to the slides.
So obviously, increasing performance is always, important, and that's something that we always focus on in our team. So one of the products that the data team's been working on for the last couple of years is something called Velocity, which is a distributed cache platform. Basically, it can store anything, and it can store it in a farm scenario. So if you're building a large website and need to store stuff in a cache across many machines, that's what Velocity is for. So it comes with session state provider out of the box. But the next level is how can we do it for just general caching inside of ASP.NET? And so one of the things that we added in .NET 4 as well is we added some extensibility points allowing the existing caching system that we have in ASP.NET to be replaced using a provider model. And so we've actually built a provider for output caching that runs against Velocity. And I will do a demo of that really quick here. So trying to save time for the coolest demos we have, which are the Sprite demo and the active record. So let's do this. So in this particular case, I've got a web application, and in my web application, I didn't change my font before I started. They're all the wrong size. Okay, in my application, what I've got is I've got output caching turned on. So you'll notice up here, I basically have a directive saying that I want to output cache for 15 seconds, and I don't care what the parameters are on the URL. And so what that means is ASP.NET will actually cache this, so each request to the page, we don't actually process the request. We actually go out there and do really good caching mechanisms at the IIS level, and IIS just returns the data. I do have a block on the page just to show this. You'll note that I've got a block here that says response write substitution. This is a mechanism that we built in .NET for ASP.NET for, in the case of having a cache page, of still having some piece of content that I want to go get locally every time. And so what I've done is I've got the local time computed here, and down here, my write substitution, which is going to run every request, whether the page is cached or not, goes and writes the time again. And this just basically shows that I am caching. So where this application is a little different than normal is normally this output caching would only be on a server-by-server basis. So if I'm in a web farm with 100 servers, each server would actually have to go send this page once before it gets cached. So you're doing the work 100 times. Now with Velocity, if I plug Velocity in, as soon as this request is made by any server, it goes in the Velocity cache. Every server pulls from the Velocity cache. So here in my web config, I'm actually using the new provider model we added in .NET 4, and I'm specifying a Velocity cache. And I've got an implementation of this thing in my app code folder. So to actually make this work, if I just run this, we'll get a failure. And that's because I don't have Velocity running. So let me actually get Velocity up and running.
And so, Scott, the Velocity cache that you're using, that's part of the app fabric that was just announced in the keynote, right?
Yes.
Cool.
So basically what I do is I tell Velocity that I want to start my cache cluster. This starts the caching engine.
So in this case, you have one server, but you could easily add more nodes, and it would just automatically scale that out, right?
Yeah, it easily supports installing on many machines, and
the power of the fabric.
I'm giving it a few seconds to actually get going. It actually takes it a little bit to get going. Same application. Run the application here. And if I sit here and refresh the page, you'll see the bottom number is changing. That's the one that I'm dynamically replacing every page request. The top one's not changing, but as soon as I get to 50, my 15 seconds is up. If I can count right. It will kick over in just a second here.
So being able to scale out output cache results in a distributed way that would enable you to have a massive amount of scale instead of storing it in memory on the web server, right?
Yeah. And
Cool.
You've heard people use solutions like Memcache and stuff like that before,
Sure.
but those require you to actually plug in some other infrastructure versus sticking with the infrastructure that's built into ASP.NET, which is the cool thing about this is we're actually leveraging the existing stuff that's in ASP.NET, not having you make you change your pages at all to support a distributed cache server.
Right. There's just web config changes.
So now the good stuff.
Okay. So kind of continuing on with the theme of performance that Scout was talking about, how many of us are familiar with Steve Sauter's book on faster websites or the Why Slow plugin for Firefox? A couple of us? Okay. So there's this book that's all about a set of rules and kind of best practices that make developing web applications faster. And one of those guidelines is using the notion of CSS sprites. How many of us are familiar with sprites at all? Okay, so a decent amount, but still very few, and that's great. Because the reason we're looking into these scenarios is because while it's nice to have this set of guidance and these guidelines for, hey, you can make your websites faster, a lot of them are trivial and non-trivial in different areas of development, but we want to make them so that any developer using our stack can just easily achieve a faster website in all different ways. So essentially what a CSS sprite seeks to achieve is minimizing as many HTTP requests that you make in the single life cycle of a page, right? So if you have a page that has 15 images, 10 JavaScript files, a bunch of CSS, the problem is that the initial request to the client might be fast, but then they have to turn around and make a bunch of other requests to the server for all those different resources. So with CSS sprites, the notion is that you take a bunch of images or a series of images and combine them into one file. So what happens is the file size ends up being around the same, or you could do some minification, but you have a save in performance because of the fact that it's a less amount of HTTP requests. And it seems like a small thing, but actually the minimizing of requests is actually a huge gain in terms of performance. So one thing we've been working on is a prototype to make this work extremely easy in ASP.NET MVC. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and show a demo of this.
A great point while he's switching machines is there's been studies done to show how much tolerance people have for slow websites. And they find that after 2 or 3 seconds, people might just move off to another website. So that's why companies like Yahoo, Google, ourselves, really focus on this, because really if you want to keep customers on your sites, you want your site to be as responsive as possible.
Yeah, exactly. So what I want to do is, so if we go to this site right here, if we go to this page, one of the things that we need to do, actually let me kill this one line of code. Let me load this up. So imagine if you had a typical site and you're referencing a series of images or you're doing it via CSS. It's pretty standard, but the problem is once again, as I mentioned, it's a series of separate HTTP requests. So if I pull up Firebug, for instance, rerun this, we'll have a request for the page and then a request for each of the different images. So in this case, I'm showing a series of logos, and you can see here that there's 7 different requests being made. Now, each of them are being made in parallel, so it's not horrible, but as the site has an additional scale and more user load, wouldn't it be great if we could see that turn into just 3? So you have the page, the CSS file, and then an image. So how would you do this, right? So if you're a designer and you're really good with Photoshop, you could take these, open it up, merge them together, and so forth. But that's only one part of the battle, right? The second half is now how do you write the code to emit HTML and then position the viewport of the image that you want to display, right? Because with a sprite, you essentially have a grid, one image that is made up of several different images. So it's kind of like imagine that there's like a horse with blinders on, and that you only want it to show the one image that you want in the whole grid. So what we've done is in the flavor of MVC, right? And with MVC, we want to be very conventional and eliminate the amount of configuration that you have to do and make things just simple out of the box. So if we go back to the code for this and take a look at the structure that I have, it's pretty typical, right? So I have a content folder, and in there I have images, and then in that folder I have all my images, right? That's something that maybe some of us are using that exact structure. So what if I could simply go rename the folder images to be called sprites, and that was all I had to do. So by doing that, I'm conventionally telling the system, anything in that folder, I want you to automatically generate a sprite for me, so that when I serve it, it's going to use a combined image. Now, in order to trigger it, right, because we don't want it to just do it by default, because the act of generating the image does take some processing time. Currently in the prototype, you would go into the global ASCX, and say initialize the sprite groups. So you can imagine where we might get rid of this completely. It's a web config switch, and just the presence of the sprite folder is enough to tell the system that you want to generate it, right? Okay, good. So this line of code is going to take care of the smashing together of those 5 images into one. So now what we need to do is the UI side that actually renders the image that we want. But how are we going to do that since it's now one image with 5 different images in it? So we've created a new helper. If we go to our index view, what we can do, so let's replace this first one. What I can say is HTML.spriteImage, and the name of the image is blinklist.png. The alt text is blinklist. And that's it. So let me just do a couple more of these. So once again, I'm not having to specify the full path because we're doing this all conventionally. We're saying out of the box, we assume by convention that you're going to put your images underneath that folder structure. So let me do this, hit F5, run the app. And we should see 2 separate logos, but when I open up Firebug, we'll see that it's actually only coming from a single image. And then I'll show the markup and how we're doing this. Okay, so there's the 2 logos. Great, so we have the images. But if I rerun this to get Firebug to show up, okay, there's the page, there's the CSS. And then now we have this file called default.png. So only one image came down, even though we see 2 of the bookmarks. Now, how that happened is because of the fact that we're using CSS image replacement. Now, we're still modifying the markup here, but essentially what's happening is, notice right here that both of these images have their background image URL to default PNG. And we're able to calculate how we maneuver the position of the actual image that it sees. So see right here, the first one is background position 0, 0. The second one is background position 0, negative 2256, right? So that's kind of the tricky part of doing sprites. The fact that you have to calculate, okay, we merge these 2 images together. This one's 256 pixels wide, so I need to maneuver this. So the great thing is that as you could see from the code, you didn't have to even think about that. Now, one other final quick point I want to make is that in addition to, right now we're using the default group, but you might also want to create separate groups. So what I can do is go under sprites and say, okay, let me create another folder inside of that, and we'll call it icons. And I'll just simply move 2 of them in there, leave the other 3 out. So now Blinklist is part of a group called icons. So I'll go in there, I'll say the group name is equal to icons. And if any of you aren't familiar with what I'm doing, C#4 has optional name parameters. And I'm simply going to rerun this, even though these are now coming from 2 different images. But the great thing is just completely based on convention, all I had to do was move the image to another folder. I didn't have to say, go out and create a new sprite. I didn't have to configure anything, and then all of the math is just going to happen for me. So if I rerun this with Firebug, you'll notice that now we have 2 images, one called icons.png, because that's the name of the group, and then one just called default. So essentially, you can imagine that these type of scenarios, we want to get to the point where any of these performance improvements that you can achieve, we want to make them as dead simple as possible, where you literally just call the folder sprites, and any images in there will automatically combine for you and give you the hooks to plug it in. Scott? Cool.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool feature. I mean, being able to have images across your website and not have to do a lot of work to go get this performance optimization. What he showed, we have a web form version of and an MVC version of, so we're going to bring it across both platforms.
Yeah. So for consistency, anything you see in the demo, we're looking at for both frameworks there.
So the final area that we want to focus on, and I'll try to run through this because we have a big demo for this, is how can we enable more rapid, faster data? first off, I want to preface all this with, one of the things that people always groan in our team is, oh, another year, another data story. And I want to point out that everything I'm showing on Active Record is built on top of Entity Framework. So the reality is, when you see me doing demos of Active Record, I'm actually doing code only. Entity Framework is the basis behind all this, which means, at any point you want, you're welcome to fall back down into Entity Framework and use any features of Entity Framework. They're all there and hiding there. So this is not a new data story or a new data access mechanism. It's basically a thin layer written on top of Entity Framework to make Entity Framework actually easier to use and quicker for you to develop. So one of the things, if you have played with Entity Framework or Link to SQL, is you'll find that it's kind of a pain sometimes to keep your object model in sync with your database. So one of the problems with Entity Framework today is if I go and go through Designer and have it build my classes, and then I go add a new field to my database, what's the step? I've got to go basically either delete my model or tell Entity Framework to try to merge and guess that stuff. So that's an area that's kind of rough. Another thing, these slides are interesting. So that's an area where it's kind of a pain to use EF today. So the demos I'm going to show of Active Record are going to show me starting from scratch. One of the benefits of Active Record is I don't have to create a database. I can actually just create some classes, and from those classes, I'll automatically get a database. This is utilizing an Entity Framework feature called Code Only that you can grab CTPs of. I think they released a new one just a week or so ago. So we're built on top of that as well. But we also allow Active Record to work against an existing database. I'm not going to demo that, but when you see my demo today and I go from code to a database, you can also go the other way around. And the cool thing about Active Record is it works with MVC, it works with web forms, and Azure SQL, which is all over the conference this week, it works with that as well. So let me show this. The main idea behind Active Record, as I mentioned earlier, is I'm a developer, I just want to get started, so I'm going to start creating some classes and utilize my classes. I don't necessarily want to go build a database yet because my schema might change, stuff like that. I want to just prototype. So how do I do that? So I'll go in here, and I'm going to add a new class. You'll notice that my app data folder has nothing in it.
You didn't switch over.
I will switch over. You didn't miss anything. So I'm going to add a new class. I'll call it Category. And I'll bring in a couple namespaces here. I'm going to bring System Component Model Data Annotations in. That's a namespace that we created in .NET 3.5 SP1 for doing some attributes you can place in your data model that show validation and some other things. And that's all fully supported by Active Record. So I've created my Microsoft Data Active Record namespace here as well. So now I can take my category object and I'll make it derived from Active Record of category. By doing this, I get a few things for free. So by default, we assume that you want a primary key, and so we give you one. We don't make you have to specify that manually. We have a base class of this you can use if you actually want to specify a primary key yourself, but by default, we just kind of do it by convention. I can give my category a name, for example, here. So I'll leave it at that. I'll save that. And then I'm going to create another object. We'll create a product object. Let's build Northwind, but do it the other way, the backwards way. And I'll grab these two namespaces. I'll move them in as well. And in the case of product, actually, I don't want to call it product. I want to create a person, actually. My anti-Northwind attitude. Stick these namespaces in. And let me go derive from Active Record. And create a few properties. I give it a first name. I'll give it a last name. I'll give it a age. Let's go ahead and give it a category. This is one of the cool aspects, is if my objects relate to each other, Active Record will actually figure that out, and when it creates the actual database, it will create a foreign key relationship between the database automatically. And I will give it a category ID as well. This is showing off the new Entity Framework feature in .NET 4, which allows you to have foreign keys. So now I've got my two objects, and let me build my application. Okay. So now I want to add a new controller. So let me add a category controller. And I want action methods for all my CRUD scenarios. I'll include my models in my file. And now I can start kind of showing the power of Active Record here. So let's think about if I'm going to build a view page, the first thing I want to do is I want to go query all my categories. So how would I do that? I would just say category.all. Oops. Category.all returns an object set of category. So at this point, if I just want to call category.all, I get all the categories. This is a link statement at this point. I could actually go and add link clauses like a where or whatnot here. But I'm just going to have my view actually just return category.all. And then I'm going to use tooling here and say, build me a view to show the category class. Show a list of strongly taped category. Good. And you'll see that, in this case, I don't really want to show the user that parameters. I just want to show them the name. So I'll just cut those out. And I don't want to show these here, so I'll remove these. And let's run the application. I have no database at this point. I've created no connection strings. So I'm going to go drill into the category page, bring up the category list page. There'll be a pause here, and I get a page. Obviously, there's no data in the database. But now what I want to do is I want to come up here and I want to do a refresh. And you'll notice that I now have a database. If I open my database up, I'm actually going to have it what's going on here? Yeah, that's correct. I've got a category table and a person table, and you can see they've got the fields. So one of the things when we do this demo, people ask us all the time is, what if I want to change my objects now? And this is where you get one of the benefits of Active Record. I'm going to disconnect that from the Solution Explorer. Let's go and delete our category view. I'm going to go back to category. I'm just going to add a new property. We'll add a description property. Let me build this. And now I'll go back to my controller. I'll regenerate the view. List. Now I've got my description column here. Now the neat thing about this is if I go back to my database, I have to run the application first. If I go to my database, you'll see that just rerunning this application, we go out, do a schema compare, and find the differences between the current schema and the new schema, and go and alter the database to match the class. There'll be a slight pause here. Now I've got category description, but that's not really showing much. I need to go and look and see if my database is valid. So let's come up here. Let's do a refresh. I've now got a description field. That's just showing how I can start with code only, build some classes. As I modify my classes, my database changes automatically. To make this a little cooler, let's go show what it looks like to write code against code only here, or Active Record. Let's go create the create method real quick. So I'll come here and do some tooling, and say, give me a create view. This will create my view. Let's hide this completely now. And once again, I don't want to show the primary key, so I'm just going to take that out, but I still need a placeholder for it. So I'll give it a placeholder and a value. And now let's go write the code in my controller for creating one of these guys. So in this case, I'm just going to actually, MVC is going to return me a category object automatically. I can check to see if the model state is good. That means, do I have a valid object? If I have a valid object, because of the power of active record, I don't have to create object context or data context. I just say category.save. And then I would redirect to my index page. Else, I would go back to the view. So if I save this, let me make one more modification here real quick. Go to my index view. By default, MVC doesn't know the primary keys, and so it wants me to write this code. But you'll see that since my objects all have primary keys, I'll give it the primary key there. Do it for this one as well. And I can save this to a build. And if I go back to my app, I can now say I want to create a new one. Give it a name and a description. Bingo, that's as easy as it is to create a database and do CRUD operations against it. Bear with me 1 second. I want to do 2 more of these real quick, and then I'll show you what the final app would actually look like. So let's go back to our controller, and let's do the edit method. So my edit, typically when I do an edit, I've got to load the existing record. So in this case, I just say category, find. We automatically put a method on an active record class that takes the primary key. So to load a record based on its primary key, category.find, pass it the ID. For my edit operation, I will go and build a view again. Tell it I want an edit view. I'm going to go take out the ID because I don't want to actually show the ID. But once again, I'll want to keep it hidden on the field, on the page. So I'll just make it a hidden field. And my edit operation is just almost as simple as the, I'll skip validation here and just say c.save, redirect. At that point, I've got an app that lets me insert, view, add new objects. I had to write very little database code, and that's one of the ideas behind this. So just to make this, round this out completely, I've got a folder here. You open up my folder, I'll just drag the rest of the files in here. Somewhere. So I've got a person, view here. I'll drag him in. And I'll grab the person controller. And I'll put him in here. Should be able to rebuild. And now I can actually, let's run this. I can create people now as well. And one of the cool things about people is we've automatically gone and figured out the foreign key relationship, and we provide drop-down lists for the category. And you'll see that I'm getting validation that my fields are required. Put data in, and kabango. So, actually, you know what that is? Let me fix that real quick. One of the things that you have to do right now when you actually have if you want lazy loading to work, you've got to make the property virtual. Just to prove that it works. There you go. So showing you some of the things we can do to make data access easier in .NET. So I think that'll be really cool for people. We're excited about it internally. So at that point, summary. One of our goals, moving forward is going to be to take a lot of our existing features, make them easier to use. So obviously, as we've shown, routing, email verification, data access. We want to go out there and embrace standards, HTML5, AJAX, CSS. And we want to have more, behind-the-scenes features. This is where the background task and some of the performance stuff you guys saw is. So anyways, definitely give us some feedback. And Jonathan and I are more than happy to take some questions here and answer anything else, you have about what we showed. So thank you.
Cool.